with our presentation. Sorry about that. That's okay. Let's come back to our presentation. We're looking at not only the future and the new past, but how those chiralities, that magnetic energy field, complements the electric field. And while the electric field will have that sine wave quality to its energy when it registers, not only on equipment, in a tech sense, on the monitors, but in terms of the way in which the four-dimensional universe actually works. Has its, Lao Tzu would use the term, the Chinese term, te. Te is the power to be, which pairs with Tao. That's why it's called the Tao Te Ching, the book of Tao Te. And Tao Te has a complement, another pair, so that there's a pair of pairs, and they emerged about the same time, but almost nobody ever talks about it because nobody sees it. The Tao Te of Lao Tzu complements the Gen E of Confucius, Kung Fu Tzu, Master Kung. Both of them occur about 500 BC, which is a renaissance. When that electric energy, when it begins from a horizon of zero time, because nature has a zero field, perfectly happy as a zero field, because she's fertile. There's a nadir about 500 years later where the mysteriousness of it all is really emphasized. And then there's an energy upturn to where one returns back to the horizon of continuity, not as a zero field, but as a fertile field. And that's a millennial occurrence, about 1,000 years later. And then it continues above that horizon, just the same as that nadir reaches an apex, and that's a renaissance. And then it comes from that renaissance where one is really enthused. We're getting it. We're going to really get going now. And it comes back to that horizon with a new age. Not an age so much, but the Greek term aeon is more correct, because the use of Greek has its roots in the kind of Phoenician alphabetical genius of about 1900 BC. That particular millennium, 1,000 years after it, gave birth to the classical languages of Greek and Hebrew. Homer and David, who wrote the Psalms, are contemporaries. They're literate. Not only that, but the language of the Hebrew and the Greek had a massive scale, because at the same time that Solomon understood Hebrew a la his father, his love of his life, the Queen of Sheba, Makeda, understood written Hebrew as well as him in Ethiopia, in Sheba. By the way, they had a son whose name was Menelik, and he's the true inheritor of Solomon. He's the true inheritor of that whole lineage. And when he was 21, he went to see his father, who had become dissipated. Too many women, too many bad songs, too much carousing, too much cleverness. And so he took the Ark of the Covenant as his heritage, and he went back to Ethiopia, and it's still there. It's in a center, a city, sacred center called Axum, and it's still there. One has to understand the new past in order for the future to have fertility. It's not that it's there, but the fertility is in the presence. And if you're presencing all possible worlds are available. It's a theme of science fiction. But in order for one to learn in that, on the scalar of civilization, one needs to come into appreciation of presence, which is really presence with a capital P, that's shareable. And so one frequently finds the searching for, the quest for, the other that would tune with you and become a shared presence. My first experience with shared presence is with the giant sequoia redwoods. No one ever told me that trees were real like that at 19. And after 3 years, I began to be able to meditate with the entire forest, hundreds of miles, stretching from Yosemite all the way down to Mineral King. This commemorative book is called Detour to Otherness. It's about a shared presence pair of science fiction writers. Henry Kuttner, born here in Los Angeles and lived most of his life here, and C.E. Moore, Catherine Moore, was born in Indianapolis and Los Angeles. They became a shared presence pair, writing science fiction, especially in the 1930s. And the vehicle where they could get published, because their stuff was really weird, was Weird Tales, a pulp magazine. And in fact, one of the illustrations from our notes today is the 1934, it's October 1934, Weird Tales, The Black God's Kiss by C.E. Moore. She took the initials because women were not supposed to write things like this. She did. She was very good at it. And not only is she very good at it, she is anciently good at it, because the center of the Tibetan Kala Chakra Tantra is about the same imagery, the same symbol, the same understanding that the Black God's Kiss is about, that she came up with, not knowing anything about the Vajrayana at all. In fact, very few people knew anything about Vajrayana, even now. They got together and frequently wrote as Lewis Paget. They took the maiden names of their mothers. Henry Kuttner's mother was a Lewis, and C.L. Moore's mother was a Paget, and so Lewis Paget. In the early 1940s, them writing together now, not just individually as geniuses, but together. And one of their collections that was put out of stories that were written in the early 1940s is Robots Have No Tails. You have to have a little bit of American history. In the Second World War, one of the big triumphal events was MacArthur coming back to the Philippines after being gone for 2 or 3 years, and everybody being a prisoner under the Imperial Japanese were insufferable, to say the least. So when the American troops came back, they were joyous to get back and free everybody in sight. And one of the places in the south of the Philippines where they were successful enough, they began to have little toasting bashes. They're called Zamboanga. And they had a theme song. Oh, the monkeys have no tails in Zamboanga. Robots have no tails. The primordiality is that here are stories about an inventor named Gallagher who can only invent when he's drunk. Martinis were the big thing in the 30s and early 40s. You've all seen the Thin Man series and so forth. Nick is always hoisting and toasting. The proud robot. Indulge for a second or two. Things often happened to Gallagher, who played at science by ear. He was, as he often remarked, a casual genius. Sometimes he'd start with a twist of wire, a few batteries, and a button hook, and before he finished, he might contrive a new type of refrigerating unit. At the moment, he was nursing a hangover. A disjointed, lanky, vaguely boneless man with a lock of dark hair falling untidily over his forehead, he lay on the couch in the lab and manipulated his mechanical liquor bar. A very dry martini drizzled slowly from the spigot into his receptive mouth. He was trying to remember something, but not trying too hard. It had to do with the robot, of course. Well, it didn't matter. Hey, Joe, Gallagher said. The robot stood proudly before the mirror and examined its innards. Its hull was transparent, and wheels were going around at a great rate inside. When you call me that, Joe remarked, whisper, and get that cat out of here. Your ears aren't that good. They are. I can hear the cat walking about all right. What does it sound like? Gallagher inquired, interested. Just like drums, said the robot with a put-upon air. And when you talk, it's like thunder. Joe's voice was a discordant squeak. So Gallagher mediated on saying something about glass houses and casting the first stone. He brought his attention with some effort to the luminous door panel, where a shadow loomed, a familiar shadow, Gallagher thought. It's Brock, the annunciator said. Harrison Brock, let me in. The door's unlocked. Gallagher didn't stir. And finally it comes that he begins to not sober up, but get drunk enough that he can remember that he built this robot for Brock. Wait a minute, I'm beginning to remember. I talked to you last week, didn't I? You talked, Brock's round face turned pink. Yes, you lay there swilling liquor and babbled poetry. You sang Frankie and Johnny, and you finally got around to accepting my commission. The fact is, Gallagher said, I have been drunk. I often get drunk, especially on my vacation. It releases my subconscious, and then I can work. I've made my best gadgets when I was tizzied, he went on happily. Everything seems so clear then, clear as a bell. I mean a bell, don't I? Anyway, he lost the thread and looked puzzled. Anyway, what are you talking about? Are you going to keep quiet? The robot demanded from its post before the mirror. Brock jumped. Gallagher waved a casual hand. Don't mind Joe. I just finished him last night and I rather regret it. A robot? A robot, but he's no good, you know. I made him when I was drunk and I haven't the slightest idea how or why. All he'll do is stand there and admire himself and sing. He sings like a banshee. You'll hear him presently. And Joe goes on admiring himself and singing, and the reader is left with an incredible insight of relief, because by the early 1940s, when this story first came out, robots had become demonically huge in science fiction. And the first huge, demonically immense science fiction robot story was this one, RUR, by Karel Čapek, or in Czech it's Čapek. Karel Čapek was a contemporary of Kafka and of Rilke. And their city was Prague, a city of alchemists. RUR stands for Rossum's Universal Robots. This is the first English translation. It was a play. And so the first RUR was really a playlet, skit, a script to produce the play. And the play was a smash hit and was produced again and again, not only in Prague, but in every city in Europe, including in London, where this English translation was finally published in New York, because Doubleday, Page and Company, it was still Doubleday, early Doubleday then, in 1923. And the cast is included in your notes. And here is Harry Dahmen, General Manager of Rossum's Universal Robots, Sulla, a robotus, Marius, a robot, Helena Glory, Dr. Gall, Head of Physiological and Experimental Department of RUR, Mr. Fabry, Engineer General, Technical Controller of RUR, and then Dr. Hallemeyer, Head of the Institute for Psychological Training of Robots, Mr. Alquist, Architect, Head of the Works Department of RUR, and they made robots who looked amazingly like human beings, very sophisticated human beings, except they were perfect. They could compute faster than the makers. They could revise the making deeper, broader, faster, higher than the makers. And so they finally said, we're going to take over the factory and make ourselves better and better, and we really don't need you anymore. In fact, we don't need your interfering with us at all. Five years later, an incredible shared presence pair would be that sort of went sour. She was named Thea van Harbo, and she wrote a novel called Metropolis. And he was Fritz Lang, and he made the film of Metropolis that, when it was released in 1929, blew out the world. The complete Metropolis is available on many DVDs in a package. It's about a robot female. Robots are neuter, so it's a pretend female, and she takes over not only the city, because by now they're after the city, not just the laboratory, not just the factory, but the center of civilization. So that by the end of 1929, right about the time of the stock market crash, was a crash in confidence about the future. That's something, as Yeats wrote in his place, The Second Coming, something horrendous was slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. By 1965, a generation or so later, Jean-Luc Godard made Alphaville, about not only a whole city, but a city that has taken over civilization. And the computer is Alpha 60, Alpha 67. And there's one figure from the Outlands, not yet taken over. who pretends that he's a newspaper reporter to come in and do a story on Alphaville. But he's really a detective. He's like a caricature in part of the hard-boiled detectives of the Maltese Falcon or the Big Sleep, Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler. Only it's done in the French New Wave cinema that Truffaut and Godard and many of the geniuses were making in Paris of the 1960s. And Lemmy Caution pretends that he's Ivar Johnson, a reporter, and he goes in and he ferrets out that the reason really why he has come there is to rescue the daughter of the computer genius who has made this whole Alphaville possible. And at first it's a quest to bring out the pride and joy of the man who would like to organize us all to oblivion. Because everything is not only programmed, you are chemically, biologically, now microbiologically adjusted so that you do not know any better anything other than what you have been inculcated with. And if you try to, for one iota, think outside the boxes, you short out. You go catatonic. Lemmy falls in love with her because he sees her as a woman and tries to awaken her by using techniques of release. He's not a handsome guy, but he has kshatra. He has that ability to keep going through. And finally, through all kinds of adventures, is able to drive out of the immense urban mess of Alphaville. I remember one time driving south from the Loop area of Chicago down through the endless streets of South Chicago. And finally deciding that it was just too depressing after the University of Chicago on 63rd and Stony, I got onto the Calumet Skyway, which took me over the suburbs, and then very quickly the suburbs petered out, and then industrial Chicago was there for tens of minutes, for half an hour, all the way to Gary, Indiana, an industrial wasteland with island archipelago of huge factories blaring in the light in the night, and the sludge fields and so forth. It was like a scene out of Dante's Inferno. We're in a time form where all things are possible, including that apocalyptic nightmare. We need a new past. We need to be able to understand that the future is not possible at all because the vision must be completely open, which means that freedom is the quality of actuality, the theme of existence, the very tone of life. And there's a concerted effort on many levels, more levels than science fiction, except in its golden age, could have seen. Now, to me, it's very familiar. This is the first book I ever bought with my mom's money, Flash Gordon and the Red Sword Invaders. It has my first signature in it. I was 4 years old. Summer of 1945. By the time I discovered that there was science fiction in paper bounds. I would ride my bike around to the drugstores and find these science fiction paper bounds. They were 25 cents, and you had to really save to be able to get them. And this was when I was 11. A.E. Van Vogt's, they call it Mission Interplanetary. His title was The Voyage of the Space Beagle. And the first story in this was the first story of the science fiction golden age in July of 1939. It was called Black Destroyer. And it goes on from there. It's about a starship, the Space Beagle, that has 1,000 scientists on board, and they're going to the Andromeda Galaxy. They're going across the intergalactic leap. It's not about interplanetary at all. Then I discovered a couple of years later that there were science fiction magazines. The first one I ever bought, May of 1955, means that it was bought in March, late March. So that vernal equinox of 1955 is the first time I began reading science fiction in the magazines and in the paperbacks and getting into the science fiction vision, so that when I was 16 in 1956, I wrote a letter, and it wasn't published until May of 1957 because the editor, Robert Lowndes, lost my letter. And in this issue, his letter section was called The Last Word. He finally published, this is the first time I've been in print, Roger Weir. And there are only 2 letters in The Last Word. The other one is by Isaac Asimov. So the aliens don't faze me at all. In fact, I think I'm going to phaser them. Because they're evaporatable. They're avoidable. And if they're learnable, they're going to get built the same way anyone will be built. If you want the presentations, chip in. It's a quality that goes back a very, very long time. The quality is highlighted by the way in which India misunderstood itself for almost 3,500 years. And after a millennia of the Rig Veda and the Vedic civilization, where the Brahmins were at the top and untouchable in the sense that no one could join them, they were select, they're off limits. And to protect their off-limit privilegedness, the Kshatriya caste protected the Brahmin caste because they were professional warriors. When I was teaching in Canada, one of my closest friends was from Multan on the Indus River in what is now Pakistan. And he was about 6'2" and really vibrantly built. He was a Kshatriya. Even though he was from a Muslim family, they were still a part of that quality, because when the Muslims came into India, they came in with their own warrior qualities, and when they met the Indian civilization, they said, well, that fits. It's just that those Brahmins now are outside of our religion, so they can practice off by themselves, but we're the new warriors, and everybody else falls into line. The merchants and so forth. And of course, they're untouchables. They do stuff, clean toilets and stuff like that. We have nothing to do with them. So one had nothing to do with the Brahmins or the untouchables, and in between, it's the military that controlled the industrial complex. And haven't we heard that before around here? What shows up is that eventually, in the later part of the 20th century, there were figures, there were characters, there were persons, prismatically, who really lived through the 1960s and really emerged working in the 1970s, and by the 1980s, when everything was getting very Orwellian, they were busy sorting out, combing out, trying to get down back to what is really going on. And one of those figures took his cue from the Rig Veda, and he went to film. His name was Fritz Stahl, and he filmed the Agni Yoga ceremony, the central ceremonies of the Rig Veda in South India, and it was published in 2 huge volumes by the University of California Press with hundreds of color photographs. I've included a number of them in there's a cassette pair that is available with the 2. They were only available in 300 sets, and they were all sold to major universities around the world, except this one. I knew the University of California Press people, and at the time, I had a very wealthy patron, and I just bought it. Elbowed my way in. The platform on which the Agni ceremony are fired clay bricks in the form of a giant bird. And here's a diagram that's included showing the whole ecology of the ritual buildings and ceremony. And at the head of the bird, just on the liminal perimeter of the ritual sacrifice grounds, is a pole. And the pole is called the yupa, and that sacrificing pole is the beacon visionary access of the Agni Yoga ritual in total, with all of its aspects to it, that it aims not to get to that yoga, but to go through it, because it's an aperture. It's an aperture to get real. If you go to the net, go to WikiLeaks, AGNI, Agni. It's Indo-European. The European word that you'd be familiar with is ignite. Agni, ignition. Ignition. It means to start, to get it going. Agni in the Rig Veda is like the Hermes in Greek. It's the messenger between gods and men. He hears, he receives, he communicates. And that communication allows for the distribution and penetration of the whole universe, not just this area, not just us and everybody that us's know 6 degrees of separation, but the entire universe. I don't care what kind of alien you are, from where you are. The distribution is universal. So when this quality happens, it happens, as we say, for real. There is a 6-word phrase in the Rig Veda that characterizes the Agni Yoga ceremony. Agnim ile purohatam yajnasya divam ritvijam uttaram ratna datamam. They give you a translation here. Pray Agni, the receiver, holder, and distributor of energy, which leads to victory of Divta, and wealth to the performer of Yagya. Here's how the Sanskrit reads. Agnim is Agni in the possessive, so that it is not only that it's Agni, but it's Agni receiving. Receiving in such a sense that it is a thrust, a dynamic thrust that he's receiving, and the receiving is a holding until he gifts it, not just to give it as a communication, but as a distribution. Because the gods are not there or anywhere. They are divine everywhere, and so it has to be distributed to be communicated. That's for openers. The second pair, in Sanskrit, it comes out in the pronunciation because the words have to be separated somewhat. Yajnasya Divam Ritvijam. The distribution is not just the language, it's the energy of the language, which fire has. Agni is fire, but Agni is fire as energy. It's not just fire, but the sun, lightning, insight. It's the energy that brings the dynamic, and that dynamic in the way in which we would really understand it now, high, wide, and deep, is that it has to do with time. Time is the primordial first dimension. The second leads to the third. Hotaram Ratna Datamam. It means those that perform. This in Sanskrit is called a yajna as a word, and it means an ongoingness like a quest, a yajna. If one performs this in the yajna, everyone involved in that performance has the language speaking with them to all. And so the conduit is that any present now dissolves and absorbs into presence. And the past and the future become a continuity. And in that continuity, all things are possible. The last great yajna in India was by Vinoba Bhave, the last satyagrahi. Gandhi was so impressed with him, he said, "You're Bhima, you're a giant of spirituality." So he sent him to the center of India, not far from Sanchi, where Ashoka built first great stupa, called Warda. And he sat out the whole of the 1940s in Warda. And he learned every language under the sun, Arabic, Sanskrit, European languages, etc., Latin, Greek. And after Gandhi was assassinated, he didn't know what to do. Well, what do we do now? And he had a vision that he should start walking south from the center of the Deccan, the center of India. And he just began walking. And he called it his yajna. And there was a great transformation that came of two brothers that ran a village, and they owned all the land, and everybody in the village was suffering because the two brothers were fighting. So Vinoba solved it. He brought the two brothers together. He said, "You respect me. I want each of you, both of you, to adopt me as a son, one of your sons, and to give me now my share of your inheritance," which they did. And he put that into a trust for all the rest of the villagers. And he called it Budan, which in Sanskrit, Hindi, is land gift. And so the Buddhan Yajna went on, and in India today, there are several 100 million people living under this, what is called Sarvodaya. And Sarvodaya, no one talks about yet. More next week.